I'll go ahead and start that. Let me let people in. All right, and so now that we have those ground rules out of the way, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. David Yamada, Professor of Law and Director of the New Workplace Institute at Suffolk University Law School here in Boston. Dr. Yamada is a globally recognized authority on workplace bullying, mobbing, and abuse. And he's authored leading law review articles on the topic, as well as model anti-bullying legislation known as the Healthy Workplace Bill. His Minding the Workplace blog is a popular source of commentary on work, workers, and workplaces. Dr. Yamada's insights about workplace bullying and other employment topics have been frequently sought out by national and local media, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe. I greatly appreciate that he is joining us today to share his expertise on bullying and incivility in the academic workplace. Welcome, Dr. Yamada.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Hughes. And thank you for your invitation to join your colleagues at this series. It's a real privilege to be able to spend some time with you. Well, I know this is the third of 4 events in this series, and it's possible that some of you have been to the previous 2 speakers. I may do a little bit of overlap with some of the stuff you've heard before, but especially for those of you who are joining this series for the first time, I'm going to try and establish a bit of a foundation for what we're talking about here. I'm going to be discussing not only the dynamics of workplace bullying and mobbing and civility in general, but then after I give some sort of an introductory overview, I want to dive into these behaviors in academic work settings more specifically, and also give us an opportunity to have some discussion and Q&A. And so I'll try to leave sufficient time to engage in that kind of a conversation. Bullying in academia, huh? Absolutely. And that's why we're here today. In fact, it was in the late 1990s when I was a junior professor at Suffolk, and I first heard of this term workplace bullying, which was being imported to North America by 2 American PhDs, Doctors Gary and Ruth Namey, who have launched what they've called the Workplace Bullying Institute to provide public education and consulting and advocacy on this issue. And so it was way back then that I first heard this term. And as a new employment law professor, once I heard about this, it just kind of jumped off the then digital page for me as well. And I said, you know what, there's a lot of this going on in our workplaces, and this is at least one of the possible appropriate labels to use to describe it. And so that's what's led me down a path to really be, this has been very, I think, career defining and to some degree life defining in terms of the people I've met, the work I've had an opportunity to do. And what I'm going to try to do here is share a little bit of sort of the best of what I've learned over the years, as well as I mentioned a few minutes ago, just talk about bullying and related behaviors in academic work settings. So I'm going to start out with what we call sort of workplace bullying 101, a very truncated version of that, because you have a handout that Randall sent beforehand. I don't use PowerPoints. I'm kind of one of those PowerPoint free type of persons. So I'm going to be just sharing, you're going to look at me for better or worse for a while, but you can also pull up that handout if you'd like. We're going to talk about the basics, as I said. And then I'm going to talk about bullying in academia and what do we know about it and how should we think about responding to it. So that's the game plan for our session, and hopefully you'll have some questions and comments when my more prepared remarks are done. So what are we talking about in terms of behaviors and definitions and things like that? I just want to run through 4 related but different definitions of behaviors that might be associated with this general subject matter. And even though I'm a law professor, I want to point out that these are non-legal definitions. These are just kind of operational definitions that have evolved over the years. They may differ from what some of the other speakers use, but I want to establish kind of a sort of a ground foundation here. So what about workplace bullying? Definition I offer is that it's intentional, often repeated, health harming mistreatment of an employee by one or more other employees using verbal and nonverbal means. So intentional, often repeated, health harming mistreatment. Verbal, nonverbal means, in other words, it's not a bad day at the office. It's not a dust up between two coworkers. It's not even a deep conflict or disagreement between two coworkers. It's not an isolated instance of disrespectful behavior. And for better or worse, it's not about like what I'd call just bad management. The definition or the way in which some of us think about bullying is that it is more targeted in nature, and it is perceived of as being that way by the target on the end of it. And the costs include harm to one's physical and well-being, as well as, of course, to work-related concerns as well. There's another term that is sometimes used interchangeably or sometimes as a subset of workplace bullying, and that is workplace mobbing. I tend to look at that term as representing an intentional ganging up on an employee by a group of coworkers using bullying type behaviors. Some people equate the two terms, but I look at it as kind of like a group setting on an individual. A lesser form of workplace mistreatment is workplace incivility. And the definition that I tend to use is that we're looking at behavior that violates conventional norms of workplace conduct. Rude, abrasive, impolite behaviors, not necessarily intentional. Again, we can all have that bad day. We can all act out. We can all just say something which we later might say, geez, that was kind of jerky. And so workplace incivility is sort of more everyday stuff that's of a lower level. Again, a subset of that, or perhaps some people would consider it to be identical, is what we call microaggressions. I think of microaggressions as less severe forms of exclusion or disrespect that are often associated with legally protected categories such as race or sex, or some of the other protected categories that we see under our civil rights laws. So those are sort of the working definitions that I use when I discuss this. And if you're wondering what I consider to be the dividing line between bullying and mobbing and lesser behaviors, there are two sort of touchstones. One of them is the frequency and severity of the behaviors, right? The more frequent, the more severe, the more it points to bullying as a form of abuse, rather than, again, the dust up in the office. The other thing that has often separated bullying from lesser forms of mistreatment at work is a perception on the target's behalf of malicious intention. In other words, an intent to cause harm or distress to the individual on the receiving end of that. As far as common bullying type behaviors go, false accusations of mistakes or errors, hostile and intimidating glares and nonverbal behaviors. On the other hand, we have some more overt stuff like the yelling, shouting, and screaming, oftentimes associated with the so-called bully boss, or maybe hearkening back to that bully in the sandbox from grade school or something like that. Exclusion and the silent treatment can be another form of this mistreatment. And ostracism, studies of ostracism have shown that they can be just as distressing as more overt forms of workplace mistreatment. withholding resources and information necessary to do the job, really passive aggressive behavior, behind the back sabotage and defamation, use of put downs, insults, excessively harsh criticism, and also unreasonably heavy work demands that are designed to ensure failure. And I don't mean those times when, sometimes we all just sort of have to buck up and do extra work because of necessity. But this is when somebody is loaded up, knowing that it's going to grind them down. Okay, frequency, how often does this happen? Studies show that about a third of American workers will experience some type of bullying type behaviors during their work lives. Now, this doesn't mean that a third of the American workforce has been subjected to the sort of the boot heel type of dedicated campaigns of bullying that have formed the main focus of my concerns over the years. But if you were to describe those bullying behaviors that I just gave you in a survey, you'd find about a third of the American workforce could tick off a number of them and as having experienced them during their work lives. In terms of who gets targeted, subordinates more than peer level or supervisors are the targets, especially in the United States. The data is very interesting that in the US, bullying disproportionately runs top down, whereas other countries, you will see it more lateral in terms of a dominant pattern. Women more than men are bullied. There is a statistical leaning on that by about, I think, like a 55 or to 45, 6-to-4 ratio in some of the surveys. In terms of who are, in terms of performance levels, high, medium, and low performers can be subjected to these behaviors for various different reasons. Who are the aggressors or the bullies? Again, we see more supervisors engaging in this behavior than peer level or subordinates, but that can vary from workplace to workplace. My sense is that in academia, sometimes it might be a little bit more lateral. Men are more often bullies than women. Again, by a similar ratio of about 6-to-4, according to surveys. There's an interesting sort of PS to that. When women engage in bullying type behaviors, they are more likely to single out other women for this kind of mistreatment. In terms of psychological makeup, some of you may have heard, and I hope you haven't had to say so yourself, but somebody might say, you know what, my boss is a real psychopath. And oftentimes they might be saying it in jest. However, we do know that psychopaths or sociopaths might be anywhere from 1% to 4% of the population, depending on the measures used. And other people might have behavioral patterns that at least tick some of the boxes on the DSM-5, the standard treatise that's used to identify abnormal psychological behaviors. So in my history of doing this work, again, for many years, a lot of the worst situations of bullying that I've seen, apparently, I'm not clinically trained, but just from my sort of, amateur psychologist lens, a lot of the bullies appear to have these kinds of traits: severe narcissism, maybe even sociopathy or psychopathy. There's another huge group of people who might engage in these behaviors, and I think it should keep us all humble in terms of recognizing when we might be acting out towards others, especially mid-level managers who might be pressured to do more with less and then sort of, put it back down on their subordinates. There are signs that, especially during tough economic times, mid-level managers might engage in more bullying type behaviors because of the pressures that they're feeling, and maybe they're not really that skilled in sort of translating those pressures into trying to get the best out of their subordinates. In terms of harm to organizations, it's what you can guess: lower morale, lower productivity, higher absenteeism, higher attrition, some higher rates of workplace violence, and also a dynamic that we call presenteeism that you might have heard about if you're familiar with organizational psychology. That means people who are being mistreated or disrespected, and they've reached the point where they just say, you know what, I'm going to do just enough to keep my job, and then I'm going to go home. But it's presenteeism suggests put in the basic minimum and then leave it at home, but don't do anything extra for the organization. Turning it back on what it's like to be bullied, the harm to those who have been targeted. Stress disorders of all types, including PTSD type symptoms, clinical depression, the whole realm of things that one could expect when someone is under extreme stress, as well as associated health conditions such as increased risk of heart disease, impaired immune systems, GI symptoms, and things like that. In the worst cases, there is suicidal ideation. And although we have to be very careful about how we describe causes of suicide, there have been some fairly strong instances of suicide, or there have been instances of suicide that have been fairly reliably associated, at least in part, with severe bullying behaviors. So it can get pretty bad. In addition, there are obviously residual impacts on one's life and career. People also bring these behaviors home, and so it affects their families and friends. So it's really a lose-lose type of mistreatment. Those on the receiving end oftentimes describe their experiences being something of an ordeal. In interviews that researchers have done with self-identified targets of this type of behavior, they've evoked language of torture, of abuse, of domestic abuse, and things like that. So in fact, many of us consider workplace bullying, as I've described it in its more severe terms, as being more similar to domestic abuse than to say, sort of schoolyard type bullying. As Randall said, I am a law professor, so I've been very active on the legal end. You can look at my handout as far as what some of the existing potential legal protections are, but I'll cut to the chase and say, in Massachusetts and in all the other states in the United States, in contrast to many other parts of the world, there is no direct protection against workplace bullying. If, for example, one is bullied because of their sex or race or a disability or something like that, there may be some anti-discrimination laws that offer protections. If somebody is retaliated against in a bullying fashion for filing some type of claim that categorizes them as a whistleblower, there might be some anti-retaliation laws in certain statutes that provide protections as well. But linking up the causes to that are often difficult. So that's why I have drafted model legislation that we've called the Healthy Workplace Bill. That's designed to provide a civil claim that can be filed in court for severe workplace bullying by those who can show that they've been subjected to an abusive work environment and that they've suffered some physical or psychological harm because of it. We're making slow progress on that. No state has yet to adopt this protection in full. But in fact, just last week, we were informed that in Massachusetts, the legislative committee in charge of labor bills has reported this bill out favorably. So it's going through the next step of the legislative process. It's a very slow, frustrating process to be advocating in state legislatures for this. But let's just say I've learned a lot about being patient over the years, and someday we're going to get this done. Well, that's my quick overview in general, but what are we talking about when it comes to bullying, mobbing, and incivility in the higher education workplace? I want to read a paragraph or two that I wrote many years ago when I was asked to contribute to a book of essays about workplace mobbing and bullying in academia. This is more centered on faculty behaviors, but I think it has some across the board application. And I'm just going to read, it's a few short paragraphs, so hopefully I won't sound like I'm reading Shakespeare, but I'll do my best. Okay. Academicians are adept at intellectual analysis, manipulation, and argumentation. When applied to the tasks of teaching, scholarship, and service, these skills reinforce the most socially useful aspects of the academy. But many of us who have worked in academia have seen what happens when they are applied in hurtful or even malicious ways. Of course, exquisitely rationalized actions and explanations occur in many organizations, but in dysfunctional academic settings, they often rise to an art form. Think faculty meetings. Okay, after repeated such bludgeonings, we may become accustomed to, and sometimes all too indifferent towards, intellectual dishonesty and rhetorical, quote, malmanipulation. Call it Dilbert in Tweed. Because this kind of mental facility often is at the heart of both perpetrating and defending bullying, academia becomes a natural petri dish for such behaviors, especially the covert varieties. After all, so many decisions in the academy are based upon very subjective judgments. This can create a particularly attractive setting for the passive-aggressive bully and the quiet but deadly mob. So that was sort of one of my lead paragraphs in that piece that I wrote. And over the years, I've come to return to it and to say, you know what, I don't think I would change a lot about that. Especially when I've seen it at faculty levels, I can sort of pick through these 3 paragraphs that I read to you to identify a lot of the things that I've seen over the years. Certainly there are other varieties. In any event, as this lecture series indicates, these behaviors are present in academic institutions, are now being studied. People are trying to respond to them, to develop some best practices, to learn more about the dynamics of bullying, mobbing, incivility, microaggressions, and so forth, and to try and sort these things out as best we can. What status combinations do we see when it comes to these behaviors? I'm just going to read off the list here of common kind of combinations. We could see board members bullying administrators and faculty, administrators bullying other administrators, as well as faculty and staff, tenured faculty bullying non-tenured faculty, tenured faculty bullying other tenured faculty, faculty bullying mid-level administrators, staff, and graduate students, as well as staff bullying staff. There are other combinations as well. I guess you could pick any of those, status combinations and sort of mix and match them, but those are among the situations we've seen over the years. As I suggested before, academia may be a host for more lateral type of aggressions in addition to the so-called top-down stuff. Now, how do we figure this out? How do we put this into a bigger picture? There are a lot of dynamics that go into understanding how bullying becomes part of a workplace, becomes permitted in a workplace, and becomes defended in a workplace. A few years ago, I read a study, or what's not really a study, more of an exposition by 2 clinical psychologists who analyzed different kinds of organizational cultures. And they were writing actually about clinical work settings. So if you wonder how bad bullying can be or how widespread it can be, they were writing about what it's like to work in some of these mental health clinics. So imagine, how ironic that is, right? But in any event, their names are Dr. Linda Hartling and Dr. Elizabeth Sparks. They wrote a paper called Relational Cultural Practice, Working in a Non-Relational World. It's an occasional paper that's published by the Wellesley Centers for Women. And in my handout, I've linked to how you can get a PDF copy of that. So basically, what Linda and Elizabeth did, and I should note that Linda Hartling is the chair or director of an organization called Human Dignity and Humiliation Studies that I've been a part of for many years, and she's become a dear friend, and I have such respect for her work. I don't know Dr. Sparks, but I do know that they work very closely together on this paper. In any event, the framework that they set out just jumped off the page for me. It was one of those things where I just said, holy smokes, for all the literature that's out there in organizational psychology, in org behavior, in all sorts of other settings where they're studying workplaces and organizations, it took two clinical psychologists to frame things for me in a way that just really made it crystal clear, at least when it comes to understanding negative and abusive workplace behaviors. So they said basically there are two major types of workplace cultures. There's a relational culture, and then there are various brands of what we might call non-relational cultures. So let's go to the good one first. A relational culture is a culture, an organizational culture that values growth fostering relationships, mutual empathy, mutuality, and authenticity. It creates qualities of zest, empowerment, clarity, sense of worth, and desire for more connection. In other words, it's kind of the gold standard. They are not claiming that all workplaces should be or can be free of differences of opinion, free of conflict. But what they're saying is that gold standard relational culture really values authenticity, empathy, a degree of kindness. And when differences do arise, they are handled in an appropriate and fair way. In other words, not sweeping it under the rug, right? If we've gone through any number of work experiences in our life, we have probably seen at least one organization where that swept under the rug dynamic occurs a lot, and it's a very lumpy rug at this point, right? Just almost looks like a relief map. Well, that's the kind of thing they're saying a relational culture isn't. It's one that will say, okay, we've got a problem. Let's see what we can do about it. And it tries to preserve those positive and constructive relationships and nurture them as well. Well, what about the other three types of non-relational cultures? Well, the first is one that they call the traditional hierarchical culture, one that emphasizes top-down power. That, I submit to you, is sort of the typical American workplace model. Really, it's one that we see all over the world. There's a boss, there are directives, there are worker bees, and so forth. If the management or the leadership of those organizations is good, then I think our work lives can be pretty good. If it's not so good, then there might not be enough opportunities for what we call bottom-up feedback, or at least cross-level feedback, in order to try and address problems. Well, traditional hierarchical cultures are, maybe good and bad depending on who's sort of at the top. But then we get a couple of other versions which get more dodgy. And the one that's my favorite, I guess I don't know if it's good that I have a favorite non-relational culture, but it's one that tends to resonate with a lot of people. It's called a pseudo-relational culture. Think about pseudo-relational. In other words, and I think a lot of academic institutions fall into this rubric, a pseudo-relational culture is one where the organizational values superficial niceness over constructive change. In other words, we're all on our manners. We don't raise our voices. We don't, get into arguments, because we're all about being nice to each other. But what happens when there's a disagreement? What happens when there's an allegation that something is going wrong, or that somebody is being treated wrongfully? Well, the pseudo-relational culture is that culture that has that big rug and that big broom, and it just keeps sweeping things under it till it gets pretty darn lumpy and pretty darn uncomfortable. Another way to look at a pseudo-relational culture is a dysfunctional family, or maybe an average family. I don't know how you want to label it, but where they're all getting together over holiday dinner, and they can't talk about anything about, other than, how are the vegetables or the gravy, because if they start talking about anything substantive, there's going to be a food fight or worse, right? There's just that superficial level of niceness. We can't talk about anything more deep than that, because it's just going to start the Donnybrook, and then we're going to, we're going to have sharp arguments, and there goes the dinner as well. So that's the pseudo relational culture. Another one is called a brute survival culture, whereby folks are pitted one against each other in a quest for status and institutional spoils. That too can be an academic work environment. And in fact, if you were to ask me of dysfunctional academic work environments, what's the most common combination? I would say a pseudo-relational culture mixed with a brute survival culture, where the perks are thought of as being all part of a zero-sum game. Somebody else gets something, that means I don't get something. There's very little sort of win-win culture in that kind of a setting. So if you are thinking about less than wonderful work environments, I submit to you that that model that Doctors Hartling and Sparks developed can help you understand what's going on, and really help to identify certain kinds of behaviors that might better fit certain types of aggressions. I think the traditional hierarchical and the brute survival cultures may be more given to sort of overt competition, and sometimes falling into overt abuse and mistreatment. The pseudo-relational culture is not going to look well upon, say, the yelling and screaming boss or two colleagues having it out. So the pseudo-relational culture then at least indirectly promotes the behind the back stuff, the covert stuff, because at least it's being done silently rather than above the surface, where somebody can be told, we don't, that's not nice. We don't behave with each other that way. So if you are experiencing or witnessing bullying, mobbing, and incivility, my guess is that model of organizational cultures will help you to sort of frame how it's being permitted. Well, what do we do about all this stuff? I'm going to give out some bullet points that echo what I have on my handout, and then kind of go off script a little to discuss just various aspects of points that I listed here. I think it starts with building that ideal relational culture, as challenging as that might be. And so I believe that we have to nurture civility. I think we have to nurture responsible speech. In other words, the golden rule. And when I say nurture, I don't mean getting into lists of that might constitute like civility and speech codes. I think especially in academic work settings, when you start going down that path, there's some unintended consequences that can come up, and they're not good ones. I think we do have to try and address incivility and microaggressions when they arise, and that we have to put them on the table as parts of our work experience. And I think that can come with employee education, in some cases, less punitive kind of interventions, such as coaching and counseling. I was speaking at a hospital a couple of weeks ago, doing their grand rounds, which are sort of their continuing education programs. And I described a program at the Vanderbilt University School of Medicine, where they call it the cup of coffee program, because they accept referrals and they field complaints about physicians at this medical school. And if somebody is the subject of consistent complaints, they will invite that physician to join them for a quote cup of coffee to talk about some of the reports they've been receiving. And at times they will suggest to that person that they get coaching or counseling. If the behavior continues to get worse in both frequency and severity, there may be job sanctions, such as suspension or even termination if the behavior is really excessive. But that's an example of how one academic setting, this in that case, an academic hospital, deals with abrasive and abusive behaviors by their physicians. So in other words, building a relational culture means trying to, address things in what I call a more positive and constructive way. You're not trying to sanction. You're not trying to get punitive. You're trying to say, isn't it better if we try to get along with each other and treat each other with a, baseline of dignity and respect? But that doesn't mean we ignore the stuff that is getting bad. And that's where I say, I think it's appropriate for organizations to prohibit abuse. And that does include the kind of bullying and mobbing that I've talked about as being those more severe, sort of targeted, repeated instances of mistreatment. And so I think it would be appropriate for academic institutions to cover bullying in their faculty and employee handbooks, and for, let's say, staff unions in universities to bargain over abusive supervision and things like that. I also think that progressive discipline for those who are mistreating others is appropriate. That could include warnings, suspensions, and if it's really bad behavior and it's just not stopping, then I think it's appropriate to show the door. And I would say and that to me at least would include tenured faculty, which I know is sort of like, thought of as being, verboten, but I think if you have an abusive individual of any rank who won't try to get their act together, then I think it's appropriate to say, well, thank you, it's time to go. I think it has to be a pretty high threshold for faculty because of tenure protections, but I don't think that faculty should be immune to those expectations that they treat people with decency. I think we do have to incorporate the limited liabilities and obligations into this. So things like sexual harassment, whistleblowing laws, anti-retaliation protections, and so on can be part of that mix as well. And that involves a whole bunch of academic stakeholders. So I just listed out here on my handout people who should be included in this. It basically is everyone, right? Faculty, staff, administration generally, unions, human resources office, ombuds, about which I'll say a little bit more later, because I know you folks have both a university and graduate student ombuds, university council, as well as graduate students as a standalone stakeholder group. I think all of those groups have to be heard and included in the conversation, because once you start not including folks, that actually is starting to kind of create the kind of mix that can lead to incivilities and microaggressions, and sometimes even worse, bullying and mobbing type behaviors. I don't suggest that there is a one size fits all type of program or policy or protocol for this. Each organization has to take into account their unique structures, their unique cultures, and also, frankly, any histories with this kind of behavior. Is there a need for troubleshooting certain types or patterns of behavior that have come up in a higher education work setting that may be more unique to a department, a school, a university? And so there has to be room for thinking about this and tailoring responses individually. A word about the role of ombuds. First, I think it's really good when employers have ombuds. the independence of ombuds can vary widely. Um, Many years ago, I gave a keynote address on bullying to the International Society for Ombuds. I don't know if they use ombuds persons now or some other term, but I was very curious to get feedback from ombuds some of whom felt more independent and protected in their jobs, and others who felt like they had to toe a certain line, even though unofficially or officially they were said to be independent. But in any event, I think ombuds can play an important role in trying to first help to create an organizational culture that that frowns upon the kind of behaviors that we're talking about today, that is part of the leadership team, that says we're trying to create a healthier relational workplace culture. I also think that there can be designs for running reports or concerns of bullying type behaviors to that ombuds for advice. And depending on the powers of that ombuds to investigate or at least to talk to people, there might be an opportunity to resolve things at a more informal level. There's a big however to this. There's a real difference between trying to resolve what I call genuine conflicts and differences of opinion that have become overheated than trying to resolve informally situations where, due to circumstances, power differentials, and just individual sort of trains of events, where the situation has become abusive. Many of us who have been dealing with workplace bullying for any period of time have come to a general consensus, for example, that mediation of bullying situations is usually inadvisable, because oftentimes it involves the bully and the target being sort of given sort of equal say in what happened. And our position is that if there has been some at least preliminary conclusion that it's a bullying situation, one does not mediate abuse. That is not necessarily a universally shared opinion, but my concern comes when you have that narcissistic or sociopathic or psychopathic type bully who can use a mediation proceeding to further abuse the target because of that power relationship and because of what's happened as that relationship has become increasingly poisonous. However, the bad boss situation, which may include some bullying behaviors, but it's not really being done maliciously. It's just somebody who's maybe not that good a boss and a subordinate. That might be an appropriate kind of mediation setting. And it can include conflicts within departments, between different sort of units or occupational categories of university, a staff person who's feeling mistreated by a faculty member, or an administrator. That's where I think ombuds roles can be really important. I also know that the role of a graduate student ombuds can be very useful in this case as well. I've heard many unfortunate instances of graduate students, either in their role as graduate students or in their role as employees, as in their teaching roles as graduate students, feeling at times bullied or mistreated by those who might control their fates in some way. And there's a place for the graduate student ombuds to play a role too. Again, it's very institution specific on how much power that ombuds has. And also just recognizing that for a graduate student, the vulnerabilities are very real in terms of, no one wants to get bullied out of their profession before they even had a chance to get out of the starting gate, so to speak. And so I think those situations have to be handled with great sensitivity and with an eye towards trying to fix a situation before it gets too bad. So folks, that's the essence of what I wanted to share with you here. I don't want to go into a lot of other depth here. I'd rather spend the remaining, 15, 30 minutes, whatever, on just listening to your questions, listening to your concerns, and having a bit of a conversation. So if anyone would like to offer some feedback or a question, I'd be happy to jump into that.
Thank you. I put in the chat, you can either add your questions to the chat or you can raise your hand. And we did have 2 questions that were submitted in advance that maybe I'll read out to get us started. The first was, what can be done if you witness your boss, a high-ranking faculty member, bullying and harassing their students?
Okay, what can be done if you witness your boss, a high-ranking faculty member, bullying and harassing their students? First, and I hate to sound like the lawyer with the imprecise answer, but it's as honest as I can get. Circumstances differ. There's a growing awareness of bystander or witness behavior, and how does one respond to it? I think the first thing you have to do is find out what protections are available to you in terms of reporting. And there is no blame to anyone who, in my opinion, is wise enough to check out what protections might be available to them. In addition, what options are there to that individual to report a concern? For example, is this something that somebody could take to the university or the grad student ombuds to get some advice on how to handle it? I will say, generally speaking, and I can't speak for Northeastern, and I won't even try because, as I said, I don't have any sort of inside stuff here. But one should be careful about reporting to human resources, not because human resources people are instantly awful or anything like that, but the obligation of an HR person is to the organization. In addition, they might have some marching orders to handle reports a certain way that they don't have any control over. So what I'm suggesting is that one do a thorough canvas of your options, and then there's a risk assessment. We do know that at times those who have come to the target's defense are sometimes bullied in kind. Doesn't happen all the time, but there's a risk factor there. We like to think that we will all step up, on someone's behalf if we see mistreatment in our midst. But there is a calculus, frankly, and in a real life way that I would suggest that one take into account, and then decide how they might want to act, and do so carefully. It may also depend on things like, do you know the person who's being harassed or mistreated? Do you feel safe in approaching that person and asking them and talking to them about it? Maybe you'll learn a little bit more about the situation in ways that will give you some insights on whether or not you want to or should say something to a third party. So I'm sorry for sort of a run-on answer that isn't, just sort of one-stop shopping advice. But one of the things that I get often when I'm interviewed by media about this topic is they say, well, what advice can you give somebody who's being bullied? And I say, I can't give one-stop shopping advice. I really advise people to learn as much as they can about bullying and their options within their organizations before deciding to act. So there is a real homework kind of element to how one responds to these behaviors, either as a targeted individual or as someone who is observing something that is very objectionable and is at least considering the possibility of saying something.
Thank you. We've had a couple other questions entered. The second that was sent in advance is, who should you go to in the event the bullying is coming from within your lab, i.e. fellow student, postdoc, PI?
Well, subject to the discussion we just had, it sounds like the graduate student ombuds would be a logical place to go at Northeastern. And I will say that conditionally because I will leave it to you folks to decide whether or not what I just said makes sense. But if you do have an ombud specifically for grad students, and the situation is one where that is I guess a dynamic of trust and openness, then I think that would be a good place to start in many cases.
Great. Claire Marie, would you like to ask your question, or would you like me to read it out?
No, I'm happy to ask it. I was just wondering, do you have any advice on when there's a situation of there's somebody spreading rumors and they're just doing it, that they're not true rumors, they're being a bully basically.
They're like defamatory rumors, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Well, again, it depends. You have to assess your place in the organization. If you have tenure or long-term renewable contract status, that's different than somebody who might be at a more at-will basis. If somebody is staff, they're very unlikely to have those kinds of protections, as well as a lot of mid-level administrators. So I think you know, some people might just say, you know what, I'm tired of this crap. I'm going to go right to that person and say, I know what you're doing, knock it off, stop it. And sometimes it works. Somebody else could try the same thing and it backfires on them, especially if it's a superior. That's the more difficult situation. If somebody is being subjected to wrongful allegations and rumors and denigration and things like that, and they are above that person on the organizational chart, that's a strategic decision that one has to make. You know, let's say it's about you know, concerning a tenure situation, right? One might just have to decide, is this person going to be harmful to me in that decision? And do I address it that way, or do I just let that person bellow on because that person lacks credibility? And that's a difficult decision that requires a bit of calculus. And it might depend also on whether or not somebody feels like that the untruths, the lies, the defamatory statements are damaging and are, well, hurtful is always going to be present, but are they hurtful in a sense of the reputation and job opportunities that somebody has within the organization or elsewhere? If they are materially hurtful, then I think it's more important to address them than those things that might be, I put in air quotes, just some ordinary sniping that may involve somebody saying some reckless and untrue stuff about someone. So what I would also suggest is, if someone is in that position, that they try to find out if that individual is doing more than simply, again, the air quotes, simply engaging in untrue and unfair put downs, because it's possible there might be something more behind it if they are in a position of organizational power to affect someone's, let's say, employment status. And I just saw, information, we currently do not have a bullying policy. Okay. Oh, Randall, did you want to read the next?
Sure. Aaron, did you want to ask it out loud?
I don't want this to come across the wrong way at all, but I'm just kind of seeking advice on this topic. I fairly regularly have people come to me about uncivil behavior, perhaps sometimes crossing the line into bullying, because I'm in the dean's office, and
Yeah.
and I'm tenured, and I want to stand in the way between people and an aggressor, because I'm in a position that's very non-vulnerable. But usually they follow their comments with "don't do anything," or "I don't want to escalate this," or "I just want someone to know." That's kind of a burden. I don't mind holding that for people, but I'd rather have some way to help them move forward.
Well, first, and I'm not just trying to make you feel good, Aaron, being willing to hold that space for someone may be just what they needed.
Mm-hmm.
Just to be able to share it with someone to quote, have it documented, right? It might be not be formally written or anything, but just the fact that they shared it with someone in the dean's office, that person listened to them supportively and respectfully, may be enough for them to be able to just deal with the stuff. Like, okay, I can handle it, or to at least feel like they can try to proactively think through what their options might be. And so if somebody asks you not to do anything, I don't think you should feel like too frustrated about that, because you've done that person a great favor just by being a good listener. If they do ask you to do something, actually, that's when it gets more difficult, right? Because depending on the different, ways in which people are lining up and who's this and all the
Yeah,
politics.
so I just immediately go to Randall and Oyenda if that happens.
Well, I think you've got some good common sense people to appeal to. And in that case, then you can get to whether or not there has to be some plan of response or investigation or action. But I hear you a lot. This happens a lot, unfortunately, as well with sexual harassment situations, right?
Yeah.
Somebody.
Well, I'll go to Title IX if I hear anything
Yeah,
like
and
that.
then there's an
Yeah.
instant, there's a legal thing that kicks in. But aside from what Title IX requires, a lot of individuals just want to be able to talk to someone about it. And that act alone can be very empowering to them, especially if the person who listens to them is doing so in a respectful way. It can just all of a sudden, people just say, okay, I shared that with someone. They get a little confidence. Sometimes they can, even just know when, hey, you can keep doing this to me, but it's not gonna affect me, because guess what, bucko, I'm stronger than you. Now that's for the lower level stuff. When it gets to be real targeted harassment and bullying, obviously it's gonna have more of a cost.
I mean, to partially answer my own question, one thing that did really help me in regards to Title IX is I'm an obligate reporter. People tell me about sexual harassment, I have to report, but there are people on campus that don't. So if you just want to have a conversation, it helped me to know that I could refer to people to student health or to spiritual life. There are some people who are not obligate reporters they could just have a conversation with if that's what they need.
Yes, and also, in the cost benefit analysis, and I hate to put it like this, of whether one does speak out about being subjected to, let's say, incivility, being able to talk to clergy or to a counselor, someone like that, might be just what they need. It doesn't excuse that behavior.
No.
But, we all make those decisions about, well, do I say something or do I just try and deal with it? Sometimes in an odd way, it can be easier just to deal with it rather than getting into a situation that starts to escalate internally, right? So we all have to make decisions like that. But, having you folks there can be very useful. And ironically, if you were to institute a formal bullying policy, that would actually put more burdens on a dean's office in terms of official responses. So there are all sorts of dynamics that are created once something goes into, like, let's say, the employee handbook or something like that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? And raise your hand or just unmute.
I had a quick question.
Sure, go ahead, John.
Sure. I mean, my question is kind of around the culture. I feel like a lot of people that are in faculty positions now were subjected to really bad culture when they were students.
Yeah.
And so there's a little bit of a like, oh, well, my day it was like this. It's kind of like well, I'm going to haze somebody because I was hazed mentality, to put it in really blunt terms. How do you help overcome that thinking and kind of move people away from like what happened in the past that this isn't acceptable now?
Yeah, I think it's up to, in my opinion, if it's a faculty situation like that, it's up to tenured faculty to be the ones to raise their hands and say, we can't be treating people like this, even if that's how we were, quote, brought up. And believe me, as a law professor, I kind of see that the melding of two wonderful cultures when they get dysfunctional of higher education and law, which is sort of like, geez, that's really the magic mix for both aggressive and passive aggressive. And if it gets really poisonous, I think a tenured faculty member has to be one of those individuals who, risk some of that privilege that we have to say that these behaviors are wrong. And it doesn't mean that you'll always be welcomed with open arms for saying that, but sometimes those messages can just be planted in people, even if they're sort of grumbling about it. And once it starts to create more of a norm, then you see, if not a culture transformation, at least less of the truly awful stuff that can be directed downward towards new faculty or staff or administration. And that can transform over time, as you have groups go through the school generationally. It's changing academic culture is really hard, right? Because there are a lot of people who just stay. That's the nature of universities. And so if a culture is not ideal, that it falls under that relational culture model that I described, then I find that it's more incremental than, sort of like, turning a big page all of a sudden.
Hazel, I saw your hand up.
Thanks, Randall. I took it down again because I wasn't sure exactly if it was, I think maybe John asked some of my question there. Let me, David, thank you so much, firstly, for this really lucid, clear discussion. It's absolutely fantastic. I've
Thank
so
you.
enjoyed sitting and hearing your thoughts and reading your proposal for bullying legislation. I think it's really very important. So I'm very grateful that you're here, and many thanks to Randall for organizing this meeting with us all today. I was going to ask a question along the lines of the previous one is, where's the bully versus the clueless person? What's the kind of fulcrum there? Because I do think there is a category that, and it's a continuum, I think,
Yeah.
of bully to clueless. And of course, we view clueless people as more fondly than we view bullies, and we might treat them differently. And, do you have a sense or a rubric for how you deal with someone on this continuum of clueless to bully?
Yeah. I might put it, and again, I want to emphasize that I am not speaking as a psychologist, because I'm not, but I've learned so much about psychology over the last 20 years. And I'm framing it more and more in those kinds of terms when it comes to looking at the bullies, right? The so-called bullies. I think if there's some, even if it's just sort of an unofficial determination that you are dealing with someone whose qualities are deeply narcissistic or sociopathic or psychopathic, dealing with that kind of person is downright scary. I've met some of them. I've met a few of them in academia. They send a chill up my spine. And if you are dealing with that kind of individual, then you are also dealing with someone who is likely very good at what they're doing, and more likely not to be doing things by accident, but rather by design. There are some people I have learned where anything that comes out of their mouth, I always ask what's in it for them and what's the hidden agenda behind it. And I'm rarely shocked, to find out there was something more than that. If it's the, sort of the more socially challenged individual whose desk side manner may be abrasive, I think a lot of folks like that can, conversations by the right individuals can help. If somebody has a condition, if somebody, say, is on the spectrum somewhere, that could make a difference in terms of autistic behaviors. So once again, we get, the mix of psychology as part of that, as a possible thing that we should be aware of. And so it does depend on how one sort of sizes up not only the behavior, but the individual who is engaging in that behavior, and whether or not it is connected to something that could be psychiatric. For example, you can get people who have suffered real abuse in their life, and they become borderline personality disorder, right? Which is a really terrible diagnosis for somebody to hear, but it can also result in some really awful behaviors, right? And so, yeah, I'm more and more looking at, okay, what's that person's emotional and psychological makeup in assessing who might be approachable, who might be coachable, versus people whose intentions, because of whatever wiring they have, are almost always going to have some agenda behind it. And oftentimes that agenda includes, sort of casually hurting people at times. And that's a horrible thing to say, but there are enough people in our population who act that way, and they do find their way into academic work settings as well.
Thank you. That's
I'm sorry, that's kind of a bleak, thing, but boy, oh boy, I've just, during the years I've been doing this, the scariest types of situations have been where, even if it's a secondhand report, when you hear a person's behavior and actions being described a certain way, I just start to go, uh-oh, it's kind of one of those,
yeah.
real predator type individuals.
Mhm.
And one can, mislabel people like that. However, I will bring up a little other thing that maybe is sort of what's informing me. There's a psychiatrist, and also he's an MD JD. Think about that. Think about, like, going through both law school and med school. That takes a lot. But anyway, his name is Ronald Schouten, and he's conceptualized a category of individuals that he calls the almost psychopath. In other words, it's folks who are subclinical, who may not check all the boxes in the different diagnostic models, but who demonstrate a lot of those qualities, like, frankly, a lack of conscience, sort of a facile ability to just, see people experience and help to cause misfortune, things like that. And he estimates that could be upwards of 5 to 10% of the population. And this guy is not one of these, he's not looking to try and make headlines for this. He arrived at this through a lot of research and a lot of contemplation. And when I heard that percentage, I said, oh, that kind of explains some of the things we see in workplaces, because there are also some studies that suggest that the higher up we go on organizational charts, the more likely we are to see some of these more aggressive behaviors. So anyway, I'm rambling a bit, but I guess I'm just suggesting that the really bad situations oftentimes are the result of people who have some bad intentions, not just sort of the accidental one, or somebody who might have some issues with just processing how they get along with people, but those who really are able to form that intention to mistreat.
Thank you. That's very helpful. It really, makes us think, I think, very deeply about, situations that we all encounter.
Thank you. I know I just brightened up everyone's day with that last.
Anyone else have a question?
World, catch of the world. Would anyone else like to ask any questions? Randall, would you like to wrap things up? And my contact information is in the handout, as well as other resources that if people want to learn more. A lot of the resources I listed are available without charge. And so you can, as I said, I think if you know somebody in these situations, or you find yourself in it, it's good to do some self-education on this to just kind of get a sense of where the center of gravity is in a given scenario.
Yes, please join me in thanking Dr. Yamada for leading this really valuable discussion. That was wonderful.
Thank you so much.
I did put a link in the chat. You'll also get an email if you would like to provide feedback on today's session. We'd appreciate that. And I'll just give a plug for the final event in this series, which is Thursday from 10:30 to 11:30 with Dr. Morteza Mahmoudi, who will be talking about his efforts in academia to end workplace bullying. So thanks again, David. We really appreciate it. And thank you all for coming.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. I'm very grateful for the invitation to speak with you folks.
Thank you so much. Really outstanding.
Oh, bye. I'm very appreciative. Thanks so much. All right.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Take care.